In 1949, the Republic of China collapsed on the mainland. Over the span of 7 years, 1948 to 1955, many refugees fled the Communist Party as it consolidated control over the country. The vast majority of those refugees escaped to Taiwan, often with little else but the clothes on their back. There, they would find themselves trying to make new lives as strangers in a new land. Today, they make up 10% of the current population residing here. These people would be called the Waishengren, literally translated as people from an outside province. In this video, I want to talk about the Waishengren and their story. It is frequently cited in random news or articles that millions of Waishengren came to Taiwan during the turbulent final years of the Chinese Civil War, but the actual number they quote fluctuates. How many actually came? Finding out the answer to that question is unsurprisingly difficult. The Great Retreat took place during the time after World War II, which was a really disruptive period for Taiwan Islanders. Then there was the cessation of Taiwan Island from Japan to China. Then there was the 228 incident. Then there was the Great Retreat. So they weren't exactly keen on doing accurate censuses at the time. So we gotta make estimates. Japan's most recent accurate census of Taiwan's population was 6.5 million as of 1945. 500,000 were Japanese colonials. Those people would all be shipped back to Japan at the end of the war, so we would need to subtract them. We only have relevant data of Taiwan populations starting 1956, when the Kuomintang Party State conducted its first review of the island as part of its sweeps of CCP spies and saboteurs. As it had national security implications, the census was done in an accurate and timely manner, as not being counted would literally mean you go to jail. The census showed a total of 637,155 civilian mainlander immigrants living on Taiwan. Add to that research of Kuomintang soldiers withdrawn to Taiwan Island. Many of them lived and still live in military villages on the outskirts of major towns, and that adds another 600,000, which brings you to the approximate figure of 1.2 million Waishengren. This number range has been roughly corroborated in other studies. So in just a few years, an island of 6 million people absorbed a refugee population of over 15% of its previous size. The Waishengren added a brand new aspect to the island's culture and would change it forever. Waishengren settled all over Taiwan, but most of them chose to live in the cities. 70% of the civilian population ended up in either Taipei, Kaohsiung, Taichung, or Keelung, which was a major port city where most of the refugees arrived at, or Tainan. The larger proportion, up to a third, chose to live in Taipei, where they made up nearly 40% of the urban population. Taipei's population exploded from 270,000 people at the end of 1946 to 560,000 in 1951. The mainlanders did not choose the cities because they were urban hipsters and Taipei offered the hottest cafes and the freshest coffee. It was due to the fact that major cities offered better support networks, empty houses left behind from when the Japanese were kicked out, and the fact that, frankly, the Taiwanese and the mainlanders were not really getting along. Going to the countryside where there would be a significant minority seemed to be a recipe for disaster. Both populations might be made up of Han people, but the differences between the Taiwanese and the mainlanders are significant enough to cause significant disruption to both their lives. Both sides had huge issues with one another. From the Taiwanese point of view, the mainlanders were often unwelcome. They came with little money, or too much, and kept to themselves, and they often spoke a language mutually unintelligible with their own, Mandarin Cantonese versus Taiwanese dialect and Japanese. The mainlanders' preference for the cities meant you had land speculators and substantial corruption in the buying and selling of property in places like Taipei. The price of real estate in Taipei skyrocketed, and the locals could not buy. Sounds familiar. And worst of all, the refugees came along with and represented an oppressive regime that just a few years ago slaughtered their kind all across the island and then squeezed their resources to contribute towards a war that they could not win. The 228 incident represented a breaking point between the Kuomintang government and the native Taiwanese, such to the point that many Taiwanese today still see the post-1945 Kuomintang government as yet another colonizer in a long line of them over the decades. From the mainlanders' point of view, the Taiwanese people were traitors. You see, for 50 years, the Japanese colonized and ran Taiwan, and many Taiwanese thus learned and spoke only Japanese. My grandfather, for example, was one such person. And the mainlanders in China had just ended a really brutal war with Japan. The vestiges of Japanese colonization and the continued use of Japanese language in day-to-day life, the mainlanders saw as absolutely abhorrent. This would in turn cause the native Taiwanese to use Japanese even more, even when not necessary, as a small show of their defiance. The Kuomintang shared this view and actively sought to suppress the Japanese influence culture of the native-born Taiwanese population, or as we would call Waishengren. The Kuomintang wanted to remake Taiwan as a model province of their good governance. Their belief that their stay there in Taiwan would only be temporary meant little care was taken for Taiwanese culture preservation. They started with education. The nationalist state worked hard to make Taiwanese children Chinese. This included great emphasis on learning the Mandarin dialect and quote-unquote indigenous Chinese values. Mainlanders found the Taiwanese festivals and temples dedicated to local deities quote-unquote wasteful and backwards. They would seek to promote their own stories and histories instead. When you think of the Waishengren, you are most apt to think of the military people, the politicians, and the rich business classes fleeing the communist takeover. But the reality is that most of them were ordinary folk, pressed into the Kuomintang army during the Civil War's final days. They came to Taiwan with little to give or offer. Taiwan's economy in the post-World War II days was shot. Runaway inflation triggered in part by the Kuomintang handover and the Kuomintang's exploitation of the island for wartime supplies wiped out many people's savings. A fried roll would cost you those days 8,000 Taiwan dollars, a huge price increase from its former price of a single dime. In June 1949, the Kuomintang Taiwan government issued a currency reform, creating the currency Taiwan uses today, the new Taiwan dollar. It replaced the old Taiwan dollar at a rate of 40,000 to 1. Everyone, Waishengren and Waishengren alike, lost their life savings except for the speculators and politicians who knew what was up. The new Taiwan dollar would hold thanks to American aid and a huge amount of gold transported over by the Kuomintang government during the retreat, but those savings were lost anyway. Taiwan needed to build housing for 1 million new people, and this created rich opportunities for corruption. You would have Waishengren living and camping on the streets of Taipei, Taichung, and Kaohsiung, while the politically connected officials illegally seized Japanese properties for themselves. Shantytowns and illegal buildings rose up around the cities, and the refugees were simply building wherever they could find on whatever vacant land they found. Such locations had massive sanitation and health issues. These were people just trying to make it to the next day. Crime and criminal enterprise increased. A social survey done in the 60s found that a quarter of rickshaw pullers around Taipei were Waishengren from Fujian and Shandong. And of course, there were many quote-unquote wine houses and quote-unquote tea shops offering illicit services. An overwhelming of young girls were sold into slavery during those days. And then there was the White Terror, the brutal repression of the Taiwanese public by the Kuomintang government. A 10-year summary report in 1999 found that the government disproportionately targeted Waishengren men for imprisonment and banishment early in the White Terror. 42% of the available cases involved mainlanders, high considering that the Waishengren only made up 10 to 15% of the population. It is possible that this emphasis came about through the Kuomintang government's purge of leftists and CCP spies during the White Terror's early stages in the 50s. Only in the 60s did the Kuomintang government then turn to Taiwanese independence advocates, which would target more Waishengren rather than Waishengren. Most of the refugees were men between the ages of 30 and 60. Some of them left their families back home, and as expected, they felt extremely lonely in what they thought would be just a temporary home. The Kuomintang government soon expected that they would be retaking the mainland any day now. They looked down upon any of their soldiers getting distracted by taking Taiwanese wives. In January 1952, Chiang Kai-shek outright banned soldiers from getting married unless they received written consent from their superiors. This ban was lifted in 1959 as the dream of taking the mainland faded, but even then, it was hard to get approved. Not that the Waishengren could have really gotten married anyway. No Taiwanese wanted their daughters married off to a soldier with no money to their name. Decades later, a survey found that 41% of the men in state retirement homes never married. 48% of them left wives and children back home on the mainland. And when soldiers did get married, the age gap tended to be quite large, some 20 years or greater. I knew this one girl in Taiwan whose Waishengren father was 30 years older than her Taiwanese mom. Having lost almost everything, the Waishengren searched for ways to reclaim just a little bit of home. They were deeply nostalgic of their past life back on the mainland, or of just a little human connection. Open up a Waishengren targeted newspaper during those times, and you would find personal ads from young men looking for adoptive parents. Here's one example. 23-year-old male from Zhejiang province graduated from an arts college in mainland China. He is now working in a military institute. He is a trustworthy and hardworking fellow. However, he is often beset by loneliness after work. He is asking for adoptive parents regardless of provincial origin. The candidate should come from a good and honest family. It does not matter if they are rich or poor, but they must have an interest in the arts and literature. Those who are interested should send a letter with pictures. Throughout the 1950s, Waishengren were more likely than the native population to take their own lives or resort to crime. When they died, they were more likely to have a pauper's funeral, buried by the state with no friends or family to mourn them. Over time, it became clear to the Waishengren that their temporary stay in Taiwan would become an extended exile. The official propaganda of taking back the mainland no longer ran true. Over time, a nostalgia for their homeland developed, and a longing for home. They would found small associations connecting former members of their homeland, kind of like Facebook groups, but like decades ago, sharing pictures and stories of their homeland. They lobbied the Taiwanese government to allow them to go home. One of the last things Zhonghua Mingguo did before he died was to grant the Waishengren soldiers the right to travel to the mainland so to see family. Relations between Taiwan and China mainland had improved in the 80s, with Deng's more moderate philosophy replacing Mao's belligerent one. Over 200,000 Taiwanese signed up for flights to the mainland in a single year. Both governments seem open to the idea of resettling any elderly Waishengren who wanted it, but a vast majority of them would return to Taiwan, the result of reverse culture shock. They had found that what they had once called home was now gone. One soldier went to northern Anhui and found that not only his hometown had been destroyed in the chaos of the Cultural Revolution, but that also his entire family, save one, starved to death during the Great Leap Forward. In another writing, the writer wrote, "I do not resent the fact that my hometown is still poor, backward, and filthy. The only thing I really cannot accept is that the trip shattered the cherished images in my memory. I cannot find mere shadows of them. My hometown has become a completely different and alien place. I have truly become a homeless person." There would turn out to be many stories like this. Returnees coming home only to find that their mother or father had died in a land reform struggle or during the Cultural Revolution. That their youthful memories no longer exist in reality today. I remember going to the Sun Yat-sen Memorial Hall Museum and looking at an exhibit about the Taiwanese people today. It talked about the 4 segments of the Taiwanese people: the Aborigines, the Hoklo, the Hakka, and the Waishengren. The Waishengren made up that 4th category of people, and their shared identity is such that in English, the name is sometimes capitalized. An elderly museum volunteer walked over to explain more about the exhibit. He talked about the 4 segments of the people, and at the end proudly declared himself part of the Waishengren. To do so must have been something awkward, as he then added, "Some people might have some shame or awkwardness to say so, but not me." I have seen this more than a few times. A friend of mine quickly and softly mentioning her Waishengren parents in casual conversation, treading carefully and gauging my own response to this minor revelation. Waishengren and their descendants find themselves today in a changing society and often actively manage what they want to say about their identity in front of certain groups, so to reduce any possible discrimination that they might receive. This has gotten easier over the generations as many second-generation people learned Taiwanese accents. They shouldn't have to do this, really. The Waishengren are an interesting people with a history to be proud of. Their story is that of many different backgrounds and locations, united by a single defining event, the 1949 retreat. They have been persecutor and persecuted, but made their way forward in Taiwan regardless. They came from China, but they were unwelcome in their homeland and their new one, but they overcame poverty in their new home. Their differences might not be so acute today as they were decades ago, but that doesn't mean their story should be erased and papered over. The way I see it, they are part of Taiwan as well. All right, everyone, have a good evening. The topic I feel in this particular case is pretty broad and pretty sensitive, but just wanted to. So this approach that I feel may offend a few people, but it was done with heart and love. Hope you all guys have a good evening, good weekend, and see you soon. Bye-bye.